When you think of AI supremacy, what comes to mind? NVIDIA GPU, OpenAI, endless rows of data centers. Behind that glossy picture, one country has quietly locked up a raw material almost nobody is talking about and named it a national strategic resource. That country is Saudi Arabia, and the resource isn't oil. It's quartz, pulled straight out of desert sand. Here's the irony. Saudi Arabia, sitting on an ocean of desert sand, actually imports much of its construction sand from countries like Australia because wind-worn desert grains are too smooth and round to bind into strong concrete. While the world was busy counting GPUs, Saudi Arabia was looking at a completely different board. So why should you watch this video? Right now, almost everyone treats the AI race as a fight over who has the better chip. But the real fight is over who can keep making that chip and who controls the energy and raw materials underneath it. Watch this video, and you'll understand exactly why an oil kingdom is elbowing its way into the semiconductor raw material game and why that should make chip-leading nations nervous. My name is Moon. I obsess over the money flows nobody else is watching, the ones buried under raw materials, energy, and geopolitics. If you've ever felt like you're missing something because everyone only talks about chips, hit subscribe, and if this helps, drop a like. Here's the conclusion. Up front, Saudi Arabia is shifting from petro power to electro power. And quartz is one of the cards it's picking up along the way. Let's break down why that should worry the world's chip-leading nations. Here's a myth people believe. AI supremacy is just a race to build more, but better chips. That's half true and half dead wrong. No matter how brilliant your chip design is, it means nothing if the fab that builds it can't run. And running a fab takes two non-negotiables: massive electricity and materials that can survive the process. Everyone's watching the GPU race and the foundry race and completely missing what's underneath. This is where it gets interesting. Until recently, Saudi Arabia's money story was simple. Sell oil, funnel the profits into the sovereign wealth fund, invest abroad. That changed on July 22, 2026, when the United States and Saudi Arabia signed a landmark 30-year nuclear cooperation deal known as a 1-2-3 agreement. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright and Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman formally signed the agreement, alongside a separate bilateral safeguards agreement. The deal's core provision: after a joint U.S.-Saudi study, Saudi Arabia could gain the right to enrich uranium on its own soil, something the U.S. has only allowed a small handful of nations to do. Unlike the UAE's earlier nuclear deal, which stuck to the non-proliferation gold standard of zero enrichment, this Saudi agreement skips that standard entirely. In exchange, American companies, Westinghouse chief among them, get exclusive access to build Saudi Arabia's new reactors and supply the core technology. Why would the U.S. bend its own non-proliferation rulebook for this? As I see it, 3 reasons. Lock in American nuclear firms' access to a massive new market before China or Russia gets there. Keep Saudi Arabia inside a U.S.-controlled framework instead of going independent. And manage a Middle East where Iran is edging toward a nuclear weapons threshold, with Saudi's own leadership having openly signaled, if Iran gets the bomb, so do we. So this isn't just a nuclear headline. It's the United States actively helping Saudi Arabia build out its own domestic power base. Nuclear stacked on top of the kingdom's already massive solar potential. And what's the single biggest bottleneck of the AI era? Not just GPU. It's the electricity needed to run the data centers in the first place. Saudi Arabia is now stacking 2 serious power sources, solar and nuclear, both with direct American backing. If you want the deep dive on the nuclear side of this story, I already covered the 1-2-3 agreement in full detail in an earlier video. Check that out for the complete breakdown. On top of energy, Saudi Arabia also happens to be sitting on the raw material that keeps every chip fab running: high-purity quartz. Put energy and materials together, and this is the real shape of the shift from Petro to Electro. Here's what most people don't realize. The chip itself isn't made of quartz. It's made of refined silicon, pulled out of purified quartz sand, and grown into a silicon wafer. But building that wafer requires equipment that survives extreme heat, harsh chemicals, and plasma. And virtually all of that equipment is made from ultra-high purity quartz. Molten polysilicon is poured into massive quartz crucibles to grow the single crystal silicon ingot the wafer comes from. Each of these crucibles costs thousands of dollars, lasts around 400 hours of operation, and accounts for roughly 30% of the total cost of producing a silicon ingot. The furnace tubes that oxidize wafers and diffuse dopants at extreme heat are quartz glass. The wafer boats and rings that hold and protect wafers during etching are quartz. Even the photomask substrates that let light pass through to etch microscopic circuits are made from high-purity synthetic quartz. Think of it like this. If the chip is the meal, quartz is the pot and the oven it's cooked in. None of the pot ends up in the food. But without it, there's no meal at all. And this isn't an ordinary pot. It has to survive extreme heat and chemical attack without ever failing. Chip design sits with the United States. Advanced fabrication sits with Taiwan and South Korea. But the raw material underneath all of it tells a completely different story. Here's the number that should stop you. A single county in North Carolina, SprucePine, supplies somewhere between 70 and 90% of the entire world's high-purity quartz. That quartz deposit formed 380 million years ago when the African and North American continental plates collided. Geologists say there's no known equivalent anywhere else on Earth. Total global high-purity quartz production runs around 30,000 tons a year, less than the volume of construction sand the United States produces in a single hour. And that tiny volume underpins a semiconductor industry worth over $600 billion a year and a solar PV industry worth over $400 billion. In September 2024, Hurricane Helene tore through SprucePine, and for roughly 2 weeks, the entire global chip industry held its breath. Hurricane Helene caused an estimated $20 to $34 billion in damage across the southeastern United States, and SprucePine's mines were right in the middle of it. Ask yourself, if design and manufacturing skill were the real source of power in this industry, would a single storm in one small American town really be able to rattle the whole thing? This is exactly the kind of hidden supply chain risk the industry has quietly worried about for years, a literal single point of failure sitting in a flood-prone valley. So here's my read. Chip-leading nations know their crown depends on a raw material they don't fully control. And that's precisely the gap Saudi Arabia is aiming to step into. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 mining strategy already lists high-purity silica among its target minerals, with reported reserves exceeding 1 billion tons at over 98% purity. Industry reporting has also flagged the Arabian Shield region as one of the handful of alternative high-purity quartz sources the world is now watching, alongside Quebec, Australia, and Russia. Separately, market research puts the Middle East and Africa's share of the global semiconductor-grade high-purity quartz sand market at about 5.9% in 2025, but forecasts it to grow at an 8.1% annual rate, the second fastest of any region globally, driven largely by Gulf, solar, and semiconductor ambitions. You might think having the design and manufacturing know-how, isn't that the real power? But no matter how advanced your technology is, if the raw material behind it is concentrated in a handful of hands, you're still standing on someone else's ground. That's my personal read on where this is heading, not a confirmed fact. So, what should you actually watch? First, track announcements from Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund and its mining subsidiaries on silica and quartz partnerships. Second, keep an eye on Saudi solar and nuclear power build-out news, because energy and raw materials are moving together here, not separately. Third, watch for semiconductor equipment and materials companies announcing supply chain diversification, especially any Middle East partnerships. For context on how fast the stakes are rising, the world's 5 largest cloud and AI companies are projected to spend around $725 billion on AI infrastructure in 2026 alone, a 77% jump from 2025. Global data center electricity demand is projected to nearly double, from around 485 terawatt-hours in 2025 to roughly 950 terawatt-hours by 2030, according to the International Energy Agency. AI-focused data centers alone saw their electricity consumption surge 50% in 2025, more than 16 times faster than overall global electricity demand growth, which rose about 3%. Don't just chase the flashy GPU headlines, and put your antenna up for the upstream raw material and energy stories too. That's how you catch a trend before everyone else does. To be clear, this isn't investment advice. It's how I personally read this flow. The final call is always yours. You might be thinking right now, Saudi Arabia isn't building chip fabs. They're just selling raw materials. How is that some grand strategic move? Fair point. Saudi Arabia isn't announcing a foundry tomorrow. But look at history. Real power has never belonged to whoever makes the final product. It's belonged to whoever controls the raw material and energy that final product can't exist without. That's exactly how the oil era worked. Saudi Arabia is now trying to write that same script for the AI era, swapping oil for raw materials and power. PetroToElectro. Let's wrap this up. While everyone treats AI supremacy as a GPU race, Saudi Arabia is quietly locking up the power and raw materials sitting underneath it, including the quartz every chip fab depends on. And that's a trend chip-leading nations can't afford to shrug off. No matter how advanced your design and manufacturing skills are, if the raw material supply chain underneath it cracks, the whole throne can shake. You'll never see this by skimming headlines. You have to peel back layer by layer, from Petro to Electro, and everything moving inside that raw material flow. I'll keep digging up these overlooked flows of money and resources and bringing them straight to you. If this video helped, hit subscribe and drop a like. I'll see you in the next one with another thread worth pulling. Protect and grow what you've built.